Welcome to another episode of Untold Legends, where we explore the stories found within the world of video games, movies, comic books, and anything in between. In Chapter 2 of the perfect Castlevania timeline, all the work Lisa had put into softening Dracula's cold heart was undone. When a crazed bishop ordered the execution of his wife, humanity was marked for extinction and the armies of darkness descended upon the land, decimating everything and everyone they found. But the heroic team of Trevor, Sypha, Alucard, and Grant worked together to end the slaughter. And when Dracula's scheme to return was set into motion, his previous devil forger Hector rose up against him, sent him back to the underworld, and undid Dracula's curse. Alucard made his home underground deep in the Belmont estate and became its caretaker. He studied the family's lineage and secretly monitored their bloodline as the years passed, keeping track of Trevor's descendants and the Belmont extended bloodline. He swore that if his father returned, he would aid the Belmont clan only if he was absolutely needed. Until that day, he would only act as an observer. Trevor's hunter whip, Leon's sword, and the vampire killer were tools that were passed down to Trevor and Sypha's children and grandchildren. His work as a vampire hunter regained the respect of the populace, and the Belmont name was no longer feared. Since Dracula's ultimate defeat, almost 100 years had passed, and peace had returned. The story of Dracula had faded into legend, and many weren't even sure he existed. Dracula's initial resurrection wasn't known to the public at large, and parents used the possibility of his return to scare children into behaving. No more than a long-dead boogeyman from the past. By the year 1576, Trevor and Sypha's great-grandson, Christopher Belmont, was the current heir of the family vampire hunter title. His younger years were very different from Trevor. Although his training as a vampire hunter started as a child, he never needed to use it, growing up in the safety of the Belmont family's manor. His parents died when he was young, and he was raised by his family's loyal butler, Demos. Demos was taught the skills of the Belmont clan well, and completed Christopher's training himself. He taught Christopher to live his life, but to stay vigilant of Dracula's possible return. And Christopher hoped it was no more than a scary story he would never have to experience. Christopher would often go to the Belmont family crypt and pray for guidance, wishing that his parents could return for just a moment and calm his fears. He instead began focusing on his upcoming wedding to a young woman named Ileana Richter. Ileana was well aware of what it meant to become a Belmont and demanded that Demos also train her, much to Christopher's protests. She loved her future husband greatly and was determined to honor the Belmont name. As the wedding approached, she was constantly badgered in town by a woman named Sona Bartley for deciding to marry a Belmont. The Bartley family hated the Belmonts and preached that Dracula would return someday. After Dracula's death, his few remaining human followers gathered and formed a cult that worshipped him as a god, and developed rituals in the hopes of resurrecting him. This cult came to be known as the Order of Shadows, and the Bartley family was one of its most prominent members. The cult was fairly large, and it grew unknown within society. Christopher's wedding day came, and Ileana married into the Belmont clan. Knowing that the Belmont was distracted by the wedding, the Order of Shadows decided to finally enact their plans of resurrection, and traveled to the ruins of Dracula's castle where Hector had defeated him. The church had placed guards in the ruins 24 hours a day, and tasked them with the sacred duty of keeping anyone from entering. But in the silence of the night, the Order of Shadows attacked them. The group hoped that performing human sacrifices on the castle grounds would bring their lord back to them, and they would be granted immortality as a reward. As the blood seeped inside, a flash of light appeared and became brighter. The ritual was working, and they could see a humanoid shape forming. The organs, the veins, it was Dracula returning. But he was fading in and out quickly. Dracula needed more blood, but the only 2 guards had already been drained. Immediately, members of the Order gladly sacrificed their own lives, and more blood traveled to Dracula until enough was collected. With a loud bolt of lightning, the vampire lord returned to the world of the living in excruciating pain, and his body regrew its bone, muscle, and flesh. From the depths of the underworld, he'd been watching the human world forget him, and he developed a pure hatred against the Belmont clan for denying Lisa's vengeance. His first task before returning to his destruction of humanity was to draw out Christopher and remove the Belmont clan. He took a demonic form and blasted into the sky towards the Belmont family crypt. Dracula made his way inside the mausoleum containing the remains of Christopher's parents and desecrated it. The following morning, Demos received the news that the Belmont crypt had been destroyed, and immediately informed Christopher. He leaped out of bed and traveled there. The gate leading to the cemetery was completely destroyed, and the mausoleum was crumbling. When Christopher walked inside, he saw the horrific sight of his parents' desecrated bodies, pinned to the wall with the insignia of the dragon, a symbol Dracula used to identify himself during his days as Vlad Tepes. After taunting the Belmonts, Dracula returned to the Order of Shadows and laid himself to rest. His transformation had already left him severely weakened, and he needed time to recover his previous levels of strength. To speed up his recovery, Sona Bartley bit herself and fed Dracula her own blood. She became obsessed with proving herself to be worthy of Dracula's attention. The local villagers heard what happened at the cemetery, and fears began swirling that Dracula had returned. To protect themselves, they resorted to old, superstitious vampire repellent techniques, hanging garlic outside their homes, painting crosses over closed windows. After the death of Christopher's parents, a close friend of the Belmont clan, the Titoyan family, were charged with keeping the vampire killer web safe until it was time for Christopher to claim it. They were skilled warriors themselves, and the elder of the family, Gaspar, recognized the signs of Dracula's return. He prepared his grandson Victor and his older sister Pasha to visit Christopher. It was time for the Titoyan family to fulfill their duty. Meanwhile, Christopher met with town locals and friends of the Belmont clan to discuss Dracula. Demos brought out the tools of his family, weapons they had used for generations to fight creatures of the night, weapons that Christopher dreaded having to use. Others were doubtful of Dracula's existence, but Christopher knew his recurring nightmares were a sign, and this was his family's destiny coming for him. He had no time to give in to his fears, and Gaspar entered with Christopher's birthright in hand, the vampire killer. Christopher had no choice but to take his place within history and accept his family's legacy as his own. And Ileana wouldn't stand by and allow her husband to face Dracula by himself. She had trained for this day and made it clear she was no mere milkmaid. She was a capable warrior that would fight alongside him. Christopher feared for her safety and demanded that she stay behind. He prepared to leave on horseback with Demos and the Belmont clan's allies, and rode for the ruins of Dracula's castle. Victor Titoyan was left behind to watch over Ileana in case Dracula decided to come for her. But when her husband was gone, Ileana was determined to follow his trail and convince Victor to come with her. Sona continued feeding Dracula her own blood and helped him recover much of his power, though he still wasn't at his full strength. And Sona was filled with excitement that her lord had returned. She gave herself to Dracula and gave in to any of his wishes and desires. Dracula had control over many creatures of the night and watched Ileana through the eyes of a bat. He had plans for her, and he allowed her to get closer. As he watched, Sona interrupted his control over the creature and in a blind fury slapped her away. A worthless human had dared put their hands on him without his permission. Dracula's heart still belonged to Lisa, and Sona was nothing more than cattle to him, an object that he would use as needed. Sona was so blindly loyal to Dracula that she accepted her role and hoped that he would want her someday. Dracula's presence was already affecting the surrounding area. On the way to the castle, the dead were rising from the ground and attacked Belmont's group. Gaspar's horse fell over on top of him, and he almost lost his life to one of the zombies. Christopher displayed the power of the vampire killer, attacking the monsters and igniting them in holy flames that would explode into a powerful blast. His butler Demos also held his own, sending arrows from his trusted crossbow expertly aimed at the undead. As they battled for their lives, Ileana and Victor had made it to Dracula's castle's ruins. The castle had resurrected alongside Dracula and stood tall in a new form. The rubble surrounding the castle from the previous ruins were structurally weak and crumbled under Ileana and Victor's feet, and she grabbed the ledge. Dracula had been watching her the entire time and dove in to take her for himself. The undead that Christopher was fighting began to lose their form, and Gaspar believed that Dracula's attention had turned elsewhere. Christopher immediately felt that his wife was in danger and rushed towards the castle. Dracula taunted Ileana and Victor as he watched the humans dangling for their lives, and promised to take his time with Ileana. Christopher would pay for the crimes his bloodline committed against him. But Victor had sworn to protect her and stabbed the monster in the leg, and Dracula turned his attention towards the boy. Ileana fell, Victor was mortally wounded after Dracula tore a portion of his neck out. The boy fell to his death, and Ileana looked on in horror. She felt immediate guilt since he was only there because she convinced him to come. As soon as Christopher arrived, he saw the monster taking his wife into the air and darted towards him, but Dracula smacked him away. Dracula needed her for the next phase of his revenge. She was gone and could do nothing but watch his foe take her. Without thinking, he ran after them, and Pasha tackled him to the ground. One more step and Christopher would have plummeted to his death down the side of the cliff. The young girl had saved his life, and at that moment her younger brother's broken body rose from below. Victor's bones were shattered and contorted after his body rolled and crashed alongside the side of the mountain and hit the bottom. But Dracula's bite had resurrected him as one of his servants. Pasha was horrified at what Dracula had done to her brother, and Demos fired an arrow at him from his crossbow into his neck, but it barely had an effect. Gaspar had a plan to locate Dracula and push Demos out of the way. He would sacrifice himself for the greater good and allowed his grandson to bite him. Gaspar yelled at Christopher and Pasha to stay back, and burned Victor's face with a cross. Victor retreated and swore he'd be back to finish them off. Christopher attempted to cleanse Gaspar's wound with the holy water, but Gaspar demanded he let the transformation happen. He would lose his life and become a vampire, but while Dracula's power slowly infected his body, he can feel his presence. Gaspar struggled to control Dracula's influence and used it to inform Christopher of Dracula's location. Dracula took her to a cave in a nearby mountain range and held her prisoner, but Ileana had no fear. She was a Belmont and believed Dracula had more to fear from her than she did of him. First, Dracula enjoyed attempting to frighten her, but eventually became enraged that she showed no fear. Gaspar's infection finally took over him, and he leaped with vampiric agility. Victor had also followed them and attacked. He craved his sister's blood and lunged at her first, but Christopher and Demos were ready. Christopher threw a household silver knife at Demos, and he loaded his crossbow with it. The knife launched directly at Victor, but Pasha snatched it in midair. If her brother had to die, she would be the one to do it. She impaled his heart directly with the knife, and as he gave his last breaths, for a moment, he regained his humanity, and looked Pasha in the eyes before he faded away into a cloud of ash. Gaspar was still out of control and prepared to slay Christopher for his master, but Demos sent him flying with a right hook, and Christopher answered with another one. Then Pasha, Christopher, and Demos simultaneously pinned him to the wall. Gaspar was still deep inside somewhere, and they chained him up to control him. The group forced him to lead them to Dracula's hideout, and they climbed the mountainside towards him. While Ileana waited imprisoned inside, Sona approached her, jealous that Dracula had been giving her so much attention. But Sona was extremely weak. She had given herself to Dracula as food, and the Dark Lord had been feeding on her to retain his strength. She could barely walk, but still happily provided for him. Dracula demanded that she leave Ileana alone. The Belmont was on his way, and he needed her alive. When Christopher arrived near the cave entrance, Gaspar took the chance to flee. As he got closer to Dracula, his vampiric tendencies began taking control, and Pasha ran after her grandfather. Dracula began his plan by biting his lip and planting it on Ileana with a bloody kiss. She recoiled in disgust, and once Christopher and Demos arrived, Demos shot an arrow at him. Dracula had had enough of Leon's bloodline and swore that Christopher would be the final Belmont, but not being at full strength made him an easy target for Christopher. He impaled Dracula with a piece of the cave ceiling, and he fell on the ground, writhing in pain. While Christopher fought him, Demos rushed to save Ileana, and Gaspar appeared. His human side came up to the surface briefly, and he broke her chains and yelled at them to leave. Pasha had also made it into the cave, and the crazed and weakened Sona Bartley attacked her. Pasha quickly decapitated her with a single slice from a knife, and ended her insanity, and Gaspar forced his granddaughter's hand to stake him with her knife. He could no longer control his transformation into a vampire, and said goodbye to his granddaughter. She watched him fade away just like her brother had. In one evening, she lost her only family to Dracula's evil. Dracula took his demonic form, and in a final effort to rid himself of Christopher, he snatched him and flew him high into the air. If he couldn't destroy him in combat, he would drop him from a height he could never survive. But Christopher's training paid off. He used the vampire killer and wrapped it around Dracula's neck. With the whip around his neck, Christopher rode Dracula back to the cave entrance, and Dracula could feel the whip burning him alive. If he attempted to resist any longer, the power of the vampire killer would surely destroy him. He had to retreat. He faded into a fiery mist, and Christopher fell into the canyon below. Dracula's fiery form hit Ileana with full force, but strangely enough, she was unharmed. This was the second phase of his revenge, something the Belmonts wouldn't realize until much later. Christopher survived the plunge and climbed back up, embracing his wife. Dracula's castle was still standing, and the legends of his ancestor Trevor stated that the castle fell with Dracula's death. It was clear that Dracula was still alive. He had retreated to his castle to regain his strength and complete its resurrection. His battle with Christopher proved he wasn't yet ready. Christopher forced his allies and his wife to return home without him. Too many people had died assisting him, and he refused to allow his wife to be put in danger again. Demos led them back to the Belmont Manor, and Christopher set out on his own adventure alone, leading us to the year 1576 and the events of Castlevania: The Adventure Rebirth. Christopher returned to the outskirts of the castle, while Dracula was inside, quickly recovering from his wounds. It was obvious his powers were returning to him at an astonishing rate the longer he remained in the human world. The castle had changed form and grown even larger, and monsters surrounded the area. Animals gone mad with his influence over them, undead bodies covered in mud, and Dracula controlled an army of bats from high atop his tower. Dracula could also track Christopher's progress through ghostly eyeballs covering the area that were being sent by a giant eyeball standing before the gates of the castle. Christopher fought his way inside the underground hallways leading to the interior of Dracula's castle, and the first floor was filled with many of the same enemies his great-grandfather Trevor had faced before him. Suits of armor possessed by evil spirits, the miniature and incredibly dangerous in a group flea men. A creature formed from slime stood in his way, and its core was protected. The vampire killer had the ability to destroy all related to the vampires, and the protection around the core could only resist impacts from the whip for a short time. The true guardian of the area was an incredible man-beast, a monster with the ability to transform into a large hulkish brute, and could also reduce himself into a thinner, more agile form. Christopher climbed higher into the castle, closer and closer to Dracula's throne room, avoiding the death traps placed to destroy hunters seeking his destruction, including several white dragons, the undead skeletal remains of dead dragons returned by the castle's evil magic. They weren't the only inanimate objects brought to life in the castle, though. Entire collections of weapons came together to form a cluster of deadly sharp ends to take down the Belmont intruder. Demons from the underworld had found themselves inside Dracula's castle and already made their homes inside again. Christopher encountered one of those demons, another succubus, creatures skilled in using seduction to draw in their victims. But seduction would not work on a Belmont. Christopher was too focused on ending Dracula before the destruction of his great-grandfather's time could be repeated. One of the strongest enemies found within Castlevania were the golems, creatures made from rock and powered by dark magic. Leon had also faced a similar creature in Walter's castle, and Dracula used golems as powerhouses of strength that could generate miniature versions of themselves. The final obstacle in Christopher's way before Dracula's throne room was the immense clock tower, a huge structure comprised of gears turning in multiple directions, a labyrinth where any traveler could become lost in and turned to stone by the floating minions of Medusa. Or they could end up in the labs where body parts were merged and resurrected with electricity to form monsters devoid of their own identity. After overcoming the challenges that would defeat any normal man, Christopher made it to Dracula's final guardian, Death. Dracula's right-hand man had returned from the underworld just minutes ago. As Dracula's power increased, he could sense the master and the blood of a Belmont in front of him. Trevor had defeated him with the help of his allies, but this time this new Belmont was all alone, and Death would destroy him. Christopher proved himself a worthy enemy and sent Death back where he came from. His battle against Dracula would pick up where they left off, and this time he wouldn't be distracted with his loved ones being in danger. Dracula had spent time drawing power from the Chaos Realm and was ready to display his new transformations.
As ever, the ally of worthless humans.
Pitiful human.
Defeat me now.
Dracula was wounded severely in the battle, but survived. Unknown to Christopher, he turned into mist with the final blow and escaped using his last bit of strength. His fading power couldn't hold Castlevania together, and it collapsed as Christopher looked on. He had fulfilled his family's duty and prevented Dracula from committing genocide against humanity again, although friends were lost along the way. Christopher returned home, and Pasha was invited to come live with him in Ileana. 6 months later, the Belmonts constructed a memorial to her grandfather and younger brother outside their home, and excitedly awaited the birth of their child. Dracula had retreated to the cave where he had held Ileana hostage, and waited for his plot to come to fruition before striking back. From the beginning, Dracula detected that Ileana was pregnant. The bloody kiss he had given her injected microscopic particles of himself inside her body. During the initial conflict with Christopher, Dracula thrust a portion of his essence into the particles, and they merged with the fetus growing within her. When the Belmont child came of age, Dracula could cast his influence over him, ending the events of Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. Ileana had a normal pregnancy and gave birth to their son, Soleil Belmont, and Pasha eventually married and left to live her own life. Their lives were normal, peaceful ones, and they continued the traditions of Christopher's ancestors, training the boy with the hunter whip as he grew, and as Dracula watched them from afar. On Soleil's 15th birthday, a ceremony was held to honor his transition into manhood, and the next day he was set to be granted access to the vampire killer. But the next morning, Christopher discovered his son was missing, along with many members of the local village. Body parts and blood left a trail leading into the woods, and a now older and wiser Christopher immediately knew this was Dracula's work. He dreaded the worst for his son and grabbed the vampire killer, while Ileana stayed behind. Dracula had taken the villagers and impaled them on stakes to coax Christopher into a confrontation. More lives lost because of Dracula's madness. Without control of himself, Soleil made it to the castle, and Dracula took the boy hostage. But the boy proved to be as stubborn as his mother was. Soleil could partially break out of Dracula's control, and he fearlessly spit in his face, and Dracula threw him. Soleil taunted him, but Dracula had groomed the boy to fall under his influence from the time he was in his mother's womb. Christopher followed the trail to the forest and found a new castle, constructed from rock, and Dracula waited for his longtime foe with great excitement. Christopher demanded that Dracula return his son, and Dracula revealed that his son had fallen under his influence, slowly becoming a vampire, like Gaspar had over a decade ago. Christopher yelled for his son and swore he would find a way to rescue him, and Dracula went inside the rock castle, demanding that Christopher come get him. Dracula's final plot was to regain the power that his castle provided him, but his castle had crumbled and he never recovered the strength to resurrect it himself. Dracula used his dark powers over the last 15 years to construct 4 castles, and summoned several demons to protect each one, with a guardian at the end. Dracula could draw power from conflict, and similar to when Hector defeated the Dullahan in Curse of Darkness and released enough dark energy to bring Dracula's castle back, Dracula hoped that Christopher would slay the 4 guardians so he can draw their power, and he used his son as bait. This leads us to the year 1591 and the events of Castlevania II, Belmont's Revenge. Christopher entered the rock castle and chased Dracula through its corridors, slaying any of the creatures in his way. Many of its sections were underground dark caverns inhabited by creatures that dwelled within low-light environments. The guardian of the rock castle was the Iron Doll, a demon clad in powerful armor wielding a scimitar. It was slow and it was strong, but Christopher was able to destroy its almost invulnerable armor. After slaying the monster, Christopher made his way into the next area, the Crystal Castle. Resurrected from ancient Greek ruins, it would normally be a beautiful environment covered in shiny, reflective surfaces. But the guardian of the castle summoned monsters from every corner of the underworld. He was an evil wizard known as Darkside, from the Order of Shadows, that was granted magical abilities by Dracula. He had the ability to control the weather, and used his staff to control the natural force of a storm cloud. The plant castle was an environment forgotten by time. Natural growth from plants had overtaken it long ago and covered the area in lush plant life. Christopher had to traverse carefully since many of its ancient traps were still present, and ropes to reach higher locations could give way at any moment. In the plant castle, he faced two demons inhabiting minotaur statues, Cumulo and its brother Nimbler. Christopher was able to destroy the statues, and the demons inhabiting them were released. The final castle and last refuge Dracula had left to hide with his son was the Cloud Castle, a structure high in the mountains with enormous windows that displayed the view. Christopher quickly traveled through, fighting possessed suits of armor and riding mysterious mechanisms that would send him higher into the tower until he reached the final guardian, the Angel Mummy, a monster created from the bones of many different life forms, humans and dragon, fused together and brought to life. Dracula's plan was successful. The conflict from destroying all four guardians created enough dark energy for his castle to resurrect. The land shook and Castlevania appeared again. Dracula took Soleil into the castle and ordered him to kill his father when he arrived. Christopher realized he had fallen right into Dracula's trap. This time he would make sure the Count wouldn't escape. The castle was guarded fiercely, and the monsters that lived in the castle were back. 15 years of planning, 15 years of waiting had paid off, and Dracula began absorbing power from the Chaos Realm and his castle. More and more undead creatures were returning to life, while Christopher moved through its lower levels and into the chapel located above where his son waited for him. Christopher was relieved to see his son alive and well, but something was wrong. Soleil attacked his father, and Christopher held back. He refused to give in to Dracula's plans and kill his son. As they battled, he begged his son to return to him and fight off the vampire's curse, and Soleil struck back with his hunter whip. But as Dracula would learn, the Belmont bloodline is strong, and no simple vampiric infection could defeat them. Christopher struck his son with the vampire killer, and deep inside Soleil can hear his father calling to him, and fought back. With the combination of his father's words and strikes from the vampire killer, Soleil broke free from Dracula's control. His immense willpower combined with the magic of the whip forced Dracula's influence out of his body. He was in no condition to aid his father and promised to wait outside for him, and Christopher confronted Dracula for the final time. As the battle drew to a close, Dracula attempted to escape again, but Christopher would not allow it. With a final blow, he watched Dracula disintegrate, and the castle began shaking. At that moment, Christopher became the first man to kill Dracula alone, and he rushed outside, standing alongside his son. Christopher and Soleil watched the castle fall apart together and were confident that Dracula was finally dead, ending the events of Castlevania 2, Belmont's Revenge. Soleil was handed the vampire killer, and Christopher retired from his role, and for the rest of his days Soleil made it his mission to find and destroy the Order of Shadows that resurrected Dracula during his father's time. It was too dangerous allowing their existence, and it was only a matter of time before they brought Dracula back again. The Order was widespread and hid themselves well, but the Belmont clan gathered as much information on their activities as they could find. Decades went by and the Belmonts were getting closer to tracking down the Order's headquarters. By the year 1676, the heir to the vampire killer was Desmond Belmont, the great-grandson of Soleil Belmont. Desmond focused his strengths on being an efficient vampire hunter after his own parents were murdered by members of the Order in the middle of the day without warning. His wife had passed away during childbirth, and his sisters Zoe and Dolores helped Desmond raise his son, the now 7-year-old Simon Belmont. Simon had barely started his training as a hunter, but he looked upon his father's strength in awe, hoping that one day he could stand alongside his ancestors as one of the legendary Belmonts. A family friend named Giovanni Gandolfi, descended from the man that created the vampire killer whip, came forward with information about the Order. He discovered that the leader of the Order was a man named Rohan Kraus. Zoe and Dolores found his enormous mansion and went to tell Desmond where it was. As the heir to the vampire killer, only he could stop them. The three siblings left Simon with a caretaker and headed back to the mansion together to investigate. Zoe and Dolores went inside to find Rohan's inner sanctum, where the Order conducted its rituals, and Desmond took another path in to catch the Order of Shadows by surprise. Although Belmonts focused on hunting monsters, humans that allied themselves with Dracula were no different. Once he entered the mansion, he knew he had discovered their headquarters. It was filled with unnatural creatures and monsters he had read about from his ancestors' diaries. But if Dracula's monsters were alive and well, that meant that Dracula's powers could be returning. The mansion had multiple false walls and secret passageways that led him outside. He didn't find any of the cult members inside, but one of their knights challenged him to a duel. The way to their inner sanctum must have been nearby. The pathways were guarded by minotaurs and more monsters appeared before him, and the Order's knights fought alongside them, as well as enormous bats, which were regular weapons used by powerful vampires. After defeating the bats, Zoe yelled for Desmond. She followed him and revealed that the tunnels inside were all connected to the mansion, and the inner sanctum had to be deep inside. The Order of Shadows had to have immense resources to create such a sprawling complex with nobody noticing. Inside, Zoe discovered an enchanted gauntlet, same gauntlet enchanted by Ronaldo that Leon Belmont wore. It had been lost centuries ago, and somehow the Order had found the artifact but failed to learn how to use its power. Desmond put on his ancestor's gauntlet and gained the ability to absorb magic and use ancient relics. Desmond continued onwards and discovered deep hidden caves that led further underground, where the ancient Medusa waited to defend the Order. Without the Order's help, Dracula wouldn't be able to be resurrected, and she would not fail her master again. But the vampire killer had stopped her before. After he left the cave, Desmond could feel the darkness in the area growing. He had reached their inner sanctum, built over one of Dracula's castle's ruins. Rohan, the leader of the Order, was inside, and attempted to revive Dracula using his own blood. But Desmond interrupted the ritual and confronted the man responsible for his parents' death. Rohan recognized that Desmond heavily resembled his father, and told him Dracula's resurrection was impossible to stop. He had already given some of his blood. In an attempt to anger Desmond, he ridiculed the vampire killer and said it couldn't even save his father. But Desmond had been trained to control his emotions. Anger and revenge didn't drive him completely. His responsibility to his family name did. Rohan was gifted with magical abilities, dark powers he had learned from texts written by Dracula, but Desmond emerged victorious. With his dying words, Rohan promised that Dracula would destroy the Belmont clan, and he died on the altar of the inner sanctum. Enough blood had been spilled to begin Dracula's resurrection process, and the Dark Lord stood before Desmond, another Belmont stopping him from gaining his full power. Confronting Desmond so soon after his resurrection ensured that Dracula had no chance, and the Belmont siblings promised that as long as their bloodline continued, a Belmont would always send them back to hell. With a haunting laugh, Dracula vanished, and the Belmonts returned home to the Belmont Manor where they lived. Days later, Desmond returned to the castle and discovered it was still standing. From Soleil and Christopher's teachings, he learned the castle should have collapsed with Dracula. He couldn't stop thinking, what if Dracula had survived somehow, and dreaded that his son Simon may one day have to finish what he couldn't, ending the events of Castlevania Order of Shadows. Join me next time for the perfect Castlevania timeline Part 4, The Legendary Simon Belmont, where the Order of Shadows mercilessly retaliates against the Belmont clan for the murder of their leader, and Simon Belmont takes his place as Dracula's greatest adversary. Since you made it to the end of this video, I assume you enjoyed it, so why don't you go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss any new content. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, links in the description below, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can join my Patreon or become a channel member. This is Fabian, I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.